Good morning. My name is Mark Lau, and today we will be covering the SDS2 Concrete Webinar Part 2. This will be a continuance from the first webinar that was given over concrete here. So what we will be covering today will be concrete member templates, steel to concrete connections, modeling tools for rebar, rebar placement and bending schedules, and drawing editor tools for rebar information. We will hold all the questions till the end of the webinar, and then at the end of the webinar we will do the questions and answers there at the end. So if you guys have any questions, then we can go over it at the end here. Okay, just start out here, we're going to start talking about the templates. In the previous webinar, we had members like concrete column, concrete beam, continuous footing that had templates. When we entered those in the first webinar, we had just shown that there are some defaults that are installed there, but we also talked about being able to modify those or create new ones. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into options, concrete options, and then concrete job setup. And down here you have all your different templates for your different member types for your concrete. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here to my concrete templates, and you can see the default 3 that we showed in the previous webinar when adding the concrete column. So if I go ahead and select this, I can see that it shows me a diagram over here of the size of the column. Your cover is going to be in the dark gray, your vertical rebar here in the blue, and then your ties are in the orange. So in this diagram, we're looking at a plan view of the column there. So I could select this and hit edit and be able to go in and change different things about the template for that concrete column. I'm actually going to add a brand new one here. So I'll go ahead and click the add button. To start out here, I've got name. So I've got a name to type in here. I'm just going to call this an 8 tie column. I've got my end cover here that I can control. So 1.5 inches, you can see here the dark gray comes in 1.5 inches. If I were to change this to a 3, just to make a little bit of a change here. Sorry, that is for the top and bottom there. The cover that I was going to talk about changing is down here for my cover. If I change this to a 3 and tab down, then you'll notice that my cover is at a 3 here for the sides if I've got uniform cover here. I can also uncheck that, and you'll notice that just 3 at my top, 1.5 inches for my side here. Let me check that back onto uniform. I'll change this back to my 1.5 inch cover. Okay, so with that, with the concrete profile here saying rectangular, we've got our different options here of rectangular, circular, or custom. Custom to where you can pick your different points to be able to make the size. I'm going to leave this at rectangular for this example here. We've got our width and our height. I'm going to go ahead and change my height to 1'6". And so this is just defining the concrete here. So I've got my 1'6" by 1'6". And then I have my outside here, the darker green is going to be my cover. Now what I want to be able to do is be able to add in my vertical bars and my ties in here. So I'm going to go ahead and click my add button. And in here I've got my different options. So grid vertical bar pattern or perimeter vertical bar pattern. You've got for circular or just a single vertical bar, and then you have tie and spiral. We're going to add in the grid vertical bar pattern, and when I hit OK here, you'll notice now in my screen over here, I've got my grid here. So three rows, 3 columns here. So I've got my columns and rows down here. And then I can also, I've got the 8 outside ones, making it an 8 tie column here. I also have my rebar size here that I can be able to change to. Again, have my standard, my steel grade, and then coating. We can pick our coating that we want, and then a function. So for this, these are my vertical bars, so I'll go ahead and click vertical bars for my function. So now that I've got my vertical bars in here, I want to be able to add in my ties. So I'm going to go ahead and click add here, and I've got my tie option. I'll go ahead and click OK. So this is going to come up to your rebar shapes that have been, there are ones here that you see are installed by default for the shapes. And then once we get into modeling tools, I will show you how you can create more shapes. And when you create them in the model, give them a name and save them, then they are saved into the shapes here to where you can use for your templates. For right now, I'm going to go ahead and pick a T2 for my first tie. I'm going to add in a couple of different ties here. So I'll pick T2. You'll notice at the top here it says select your vertical bars for where the tie is going to go. So what I'm going to do is I'll pick the corners here and then go back to my original point for the 5th one. And now you can see that it put in my T2 tie here. I want to add 2 more ties here, so I'll go ahead and click add, click tie, and OK. And this time I'm going to put in these T9s here. So it does depend on which point that you pick first for how the tie is put in. So I'm going to pick this point and this point, and you'll notice that I've got my 135-degree bend there. And that was the first point that I picked. So if we go ahead and click add again and tie, you'll notice when I'm looking at my diagram here on the left side there, that's the that was the first point I picked, and then my second point was the 90-degree bend there. So I'm going to click T9 again here, and then I'll go ahead and pick this point to this point and be able to add in my tie again there. So for this 8 tie column here, I've been able to create the profile there for the concrete and my cover. Then I can also add in my vertical bars, and then also my different ties here that I want to be able to add in. So now that we've got that created in our template editor here, I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then you see it's still in the list here. I'll go ahead and hit OK here. So now we're going to go into the model, and I'm going to model in a concrete column again. Okay, and like in the previous webinar here, the first thing in here is my template. So if I click on this, now you will notice that I have my 8 tie column template that I just created. I'll go ahead and select that. And I've got my different options that we covered in the previous webinar for the concrete column edit window here. I may go ahead and change my elevation here to, we'll say 20-foot 0. Hit OK. And now when I zoom in here, you notice that I have my 1'6" by 1'6" concrete column there, and I have my vertical rebar. So the main question off of this is, when you're looking at it, is I've got my vertical rebars, but I do not have any of the ties that I put in. The 1 T2 tie and then the 2 T9 ties are not showing up here. The reasoning behind that is because, as we showed in the previous webinar, when you put in ties, you can put in tie zones to where you've got your spacing to where you would have different spacing throughout this column. So if I select my column here and go to my component add, I can pick my tie zone. And then it's going to come up, we had talked about this before, I'll have my start at 0, and then I'll go my end to maybe 2'0" here. and I'm going to have some tighter spacing here, so I'll set it to 4" for the spacing instead of 1 foot. Now, you've got the tie type here. I've got manual or from template. So here where it's talking about from template is what we just created. So I can click manual and be able to browse and select a shape, be able to pick a tie that I want to be able to add in here just being manually. But just like auto standard connection, it's kind of for the template there is I can set it up beforehand, and when I go to add my tie zone, just have it from template, and now it's going to add in all the ties that I had added in the template editor there. So I'll go ahead and hit OK. And now you can see that I've got all my different ties in here, according to how I created it in the template editor. So then I could go ahead and maybe add it at 1 foot spacing from 2 foot to 8 foot. Then I've still got from template here. Go ahead and click OK. So the reason it does not come in when you first put the column in is because you've got to add it as a component tie zone so that you can control your different spacings in the tie zones there. So going back to our concrete job setup options here is you've got your different options, just like with your concrete column. You've got concrete beam, your continuous footings, pilaster, to where you can go in there and either modify the default ones or create brand new ones. Next, we're going to talk about the steel to concrete connection schedules. So in the previous webinar, we had put in our beam framing into the concrete wall and set it to a shear tap connection. And then we had our location where we picked the embed. The defaults that were installed, this is the location that they're at, is the concrete to steel connections in your concrete job setup. So I've got my embed 1, embed 2 here. I can go ahead and edit the existing ones here. So I can come in here and control my plate thickness, my width, and my length. Then I can set it up to have either my hole patterns, DBAs, or studs, or I can have any or all of them together there, to where I could have studs and DBAs if I wanted to, or I can have it set up however I want it to be there. I've got my number of holes, or I've got nailer hole option here to where I can set up my nailer holes. And then since I have number of stud patterns up here at 1, then I have my control down here in my stud patterns for stud grade, length, diameter, my stud head dimensions, and then I've got my pattern there. So 3 rows, 2 columns, my row spacing is 2 at 6, column spacing 6, vertical edge is 3. So I can come in here and modify the ones here. The one thing to point out also here is my plate location. So I've got either inside of wall or outside of wall. So if I'm using my DBAs or studs, I'm going to have it inside the wall. If I want hole pattern on there, I can set it to outside the wall. So I can either edit them, or I can go ahead and add a new one here to where I can click a new one there to be able to add, and then be able to go in there and modify the new one that I added there. So I can control my piece mark up there. If I do not want the EM3 there, I can control what piece mark that I want. So that is where you control your embeds that you're able to select when you're connecting a beam to a concrete wall. Next, we are going to get into our modeling tools for Rebar here. So the first thing I want to go ahead and point out, or actually add here, is we have new tools for the rebar. So I'm going to go up to my options drop down in my toolbar configuration. And then for my command group up here, I'm going to drop this down and select Model Concrete. So under my command group, you've got Model Concrete there. Okay, so I've got my modified rebar hooks, split rebar, extend rebar ends, and rebar runs. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab all my new toolbar icons here. Go ahead and place it up there. Okay, so a couple of things that we're going to talk about here first is our different ways to input rebar. In the previous webinar, we had talked about a rebar system. We also have a rebar area layout to where if I've got this concrete slab here with a different shape, I surface to the top here, and then I'm going to go in, it's a 1 foot thick concrete, so I'll go in 6 inches here into my slab. I'll go ahead and select my slab and then go to my component add, and I have my rebar area layout here. Go ahead and select that. With my rebar area layout, you can see where I can round my corners if I need to. I'm going to go around and just pick my points around my rebar here. So once I picked it, it's going to ask me locate reference point so I'll pick along this direction. And now it's going to come up and look a lot like the rebar system that we had shown in the first webinar there. So I'm going to have, instead of 2 mats, I'm going to have my 1 mat. To show something here first with my mat settings again, if I do have 2 or more mats, it will give me an option to be able to put in the distance between the mats here. It also has to where I can go each way on the rebar. So I'm going to change this to 1 mat. I'll leave my chair at 3. I'll go ahead and have my cover at 1.5. And then I can come down here to my main bar, so I can select my rebar size. Maybe I want to go number 7 with my spacing here at 1 foot. And then we've got our specification, grade, coating, layer usage, and then you can add extensions and hook types while adding this in, just like you could with the rebar system. Now, this is the main bar. I'll click in my diagram here to be able to pick the secondary bar and have my values for my secondary bar there. We go ahead and hit OK here. And now you'll notice that it was able to put in my rebar and conform to the shape here that I've got it entered in, to where it still has my cover here. And then you'll notice in here I've got my have my laps there for going over the distance there. Okay, so going on to our option of maybe I need a lap or a splice in one of these rebars here, just for a certain situation there. So one of my toolbars up here is called Split Rebar. So if I select Split Rebar, then I can hover over my rebar and select which one I want. I can select multiple and then right click and say OK. It's going to bring up my split rebar screen here to where I've got a max length, a min length, and my overlap. So let's say that I do not, my max length here, that's a 20-foot long section, so maybe I want my overlap at, say, 10 foot. So I'm going to go ahead and change my max on this to 10 foot. Go ahead and hit OK. And now you'll notice if I come up here and I can go up to my selection filter and drop this down, and now we have rebar in our selection filter to be able to go through and modify your rebar. So I can go ahead and now just hover over my rebar. Now you'll notice that I have separated into, been able to add my split rebar in there. Also, if I need one to change, maybe I need the cover to be different, or maybe I need to have this set back to where it's not running into or interfering with something. I've got my extend rebar ends here. So if I click extend rebar ends and pick a rebar, or I can pick multiples here, right click and say OK. I've got my left and right extension here. So what I'll show here is I'll zoom out. When I highlight over my rebar, when I've got my selection filter set to rebar, you can see that I have my crosshairs on my left end of my rebar. So when I go to extend rebar there and pick a piece of rebar, then you know which one is your left extension, which one's your right extension. So my right extension, I'll add to here. Positive will extend it, a negative will shorten the rebar there. So maybe I put a 6-inch value in here. You can see that that added, put 6 inches onto my rebar there. Or if I want to, I can maybe set that back -6 and go back to being in line here. So I'm able to extend or shorten my rebar with the extend rebar ends tool here. Now I've also got the tool for modify rebar hooks. So what I can do is I can click modify rebar hooks. I can select one rebar, or I could select multiple rebar and right click and say OK. Same thing again here is I've got my left end and right end. When you're highlighting over your rebar, you can see where the cursor is at. So I've got my rotate here. I've got my hook type. So maybe I'll do an end hook at 90 degrees. Let me go ahead and hit OK. Now you'll notice that I got my 90-degree end hook on here. So I can add on hooks to rebar that are already in place there. So the only way to be able to add the hooks or split, throw in the splits there, you have to get the tools onto your toolbar configuration there. But with our selection filter set at rebar, we can treat rebar just like material when we're talking about the steel side of things. Is I can select my material here, and then I can right click and I have my different options for copy the material, move the material. I can stretch the material to where, let's say, I just want to stretch material up. I can go ahead and stretch the material by using my right click options there to be able to stretch my material. I can also edit my rebar here to be able to change the size of it. I have my piece mark in here, my parameters, so my length of that, and then I have my specification, steel grade, coating, function type, function, and then also placement notes, which we'll get to talking about placement notes when we get into our drawing editor side and looking at the tables that we added in there where these placement notes are. Okay, so Next tool that we're going to talk about here is our rebar run and then rebar runs. So the rebar run, if I select my wall here and go to component add, I have my rebar run. So I select rebar run, then what I can do is I can pick my points. I can pick multiple points while doing this. In this case, I'm just going to pick my 2 points and middle click. It'll come up and give me my properties here. So I can change my rebar size, my specification, the grade, coding, and rebar length here. So I'll go ahead and hit OK. And you'll notice that it places the rebar in. Then if I wanted to, I could set my selection filter to rebar, select that rebar, right click, and pick copy or move. Otherwise, with this tool up here, I have my rebar runs. So this is going to allow you to do multiples. So what I'll do is I'll put in vertical ones in here. So just like the rebar run, I pick my points. It brings up my edit window here. But with the rebar runs, now you'll notice up in my button bindings that I've got left click is locate. So it's more or less like repeating the rebar run command there to where I can keep adding them in. So I have those two different options, rebar run or rebar runs. Rebar runs is another toolbar icon that you would have to put on your toolbar there, which is in your model concrete in your toolbar configuration there. Okay, next we have rebar shapes. So we had talked about when we did repeated rebar, we could pick a rebar shape. Otherwise, I can go ahead and in my member type selection under F2 here, I have shaped rebar and rebar layout. We're going to cover shaped rebar first and then rebar layout next. So I'll go shaped rebar and then say the T9 again here. I can tell it all my different values here that I want it to be. So rebar size, I could change that to what I need it to be. Can go ahead and hit OK here. And then you'll notice I'll pick my first point, and then depending on how long I want that piece to be, I can drag it along and be able to pick that option there. Another option I have that we had talked about earlier about rebar shapes. So when I pick that rebar shape, where that's coming from is in my concrete options, concrete job options, and then I have my rebar shape templates here. So I can go through my different shapes here. I've got the option to add shapes and edit shapes or erase shapes here. So as I'm going through, I had looked at my T9 earlier, so I've got my T9 option there. What you can also do is be able to create your own shapes while in modeling. So what we'll do here is we'll come through here and model in a rebar shape. So if I go to F2 and in my miscellaneous I have rebar layout, I can go ahead and pick that. I have my options here. So I've got a bend as arc, so if I want to bend it, and then I've got my start hook type and angle and end hook type and angle. So we can go end hook with 180 degrees on both sides here. And I'm just going to make a fairly simple tie here. I'll go ahead and middle click. You'll notice that it gives me my shape. I can pick my rebar. And then I need to give it a tie here. So I'll go ahead and name this test. Click OK. It will go ahead and put in the tie here. So now I can exit out of that command here. And so I'm going to go up into my concrete options and back to my rebar shape templates and show you that with picking your points there and giving your end hooks and then giving it a name and clicking OK, I now have test here to where I can use that again with the rebar shape option. Also, when we talked about putting in our ties into like our concrete column templates or concrete beam templates, the shapes that you create, you can now use them as ties there in the templates, or be able to just add them in the screen here. Okay, the last modeling tool that we're going to cover here, I'm going to go open back up. I have a concrete slab here with my rebar in it. I've got a construction line in place right here at the end to show where my cover is. So we also have a surface specific cover. So say that a certain area is touching the ground, touching the soil there to where it needs more or a different type of cover there. So what I can do here is I'll pick surface specific cover. Now it's asking me to locate my face. So in this case, I'm just going to pick the side here. I've got my different settings here. I've got my type. So I've got heavy cover, corrosive cover are the two by default. Then I've got my cover dimension and to draw a representation. We'll just leave this here. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now you'll notice that it shows a description here of my 5-inch cover, and you'll also notice from my concrete or my construction line right here, my rebar system will recognize that cover and set itself back for that cover. So anytime you put in that specific cover, the rebar system here recognizes it and sets itself back. It will also show you a diagram. So where, if I edit this again, in your type here of heavy cover or corrosive, where that comes from is in your options, concrete option, concrete job setup, and then you have your concrete cover surfaces here. So I've got my different options here for description. I can come in here and add new descriptions. I've got my cover dimension here, so how much cover that you want that to be. And then I also have a color so that you can have it signify different colors in the model there so that you know what the cover is by looking at it. And you also have the default where you can change what the default is when you first put that in. So that is where your specific cover, surface-specific cover comes from, is here in cover surface setup and concrete job setup. Okay, next we are going to go into Drawing Editor and talk about our tables again that we had placed in the previous webinar. I'm going to go ahead and detail my erection view here. And then I'm also going to detail one of my walls here. Okay, so like beforehand, we had created an erection sheet. We placed our erection view on the drawing here, and I have my tables up here that we had talked about. So we're going to talk about where the setup for these tables come from. So for my foundation rebar here, when I'm looking at like my placement notes here, I've got at 1 foot spacing bottom. I've got at 1 foot spacing bottom with a lap here. So what I can do is if I go into my options, concrete options, and then this time we're going to be in our concrete fabricator setup for this. I've got my rebar schedule placements. So when I bring this up, on the left-hand side here, you'll notice for pad footing, slab, area layout, grade beam, continuous footing. So I've got my different setup for the different options here. If I look at my table here, I can see they're both slabs. So I've got slab selected. And then over here, I've got at 1 foot spacing BTM and at 1 foot spacing BTM with the lap there. So I'm going to come down here and I've got my at percentage spacing and then bottom. So what I want to do here is I don't want the abbreviation, so I'm going to go ahead and modify this to show the word bottom here. And then also I want it for the lap there, so at spacing bottom lap. So I'll go ahead and click in here and then change that to say bottom. So to kind of talk more about this in here is for our placement notes, you've got your different options or variables that you can have in there. So you can set variables for the quantity, for the spacing, for usage, and for laps with your percent sign here. And then the words that show in here are going to be how it shows up in your placement notes there. So I've got both of those changed. I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Now, it does not automatically change. What I would need to do is come back into the model, and I'm going to mark my model for processing and reprocess it. And the reason why we kind of talked about it before, but I'll show you here real quick, is if I set my selection filter to rebar, edit one of my rebar, you'll notice placement notes. Now it says at 1 foot bottom. So it's pulling the information from the model here, so we have to mark them for processing, reprocess them for it to update. So now what I can do is come back into my drawing here. I'm going to edit it and click OK. Still does not modify, so what I'll have to do is get out of my drawing and get back into my erection sheet there. And you'll notice that I've got my bottom up here, and I'll have to take a look at where I entered it in here for this option here. So another thing to talk about our tables is that I can control what it says for my headers here, what order the columns are in. If I go to my concrete job setup, or sorry, concrete fabricator setup, and then rebar template manager, I can go ahead and be able to edit my foundation rebar schedule template. I'll go ahead and select it and click edit. And it's going to come up here. So now you'll notice I've got my default title. So what it's going to say up here in my report, foundation rebar. I can show the title, I can show my column headers, and then I've got my report columns down here. So I've got the mark, the quantity, the size. Let's say that I want this is taking up too much area here, so I might want it to say QTY here for the quantity. And then I might say I want the size before I want the quantity here. So I can select that and I can say move down. So now size is down, or size is first. I'll go ahead and hit OK here and close to this. Then if I double click on my report here, I can go ahead and hit OK. And now you'll see that my size is first, and then I've got QTY for my quantity here. So any of the reports that we use for tables for the rebar there, you can go into your concrete options, concrete fabricator setup, and report template manager. And I've got my different options here. So if I go into my bin schedule and edit this, I'm going to have the same thing where I've got the default title, my headers, my bar types that I want to show, so bent for my bend schedule, and then also my diagrams here. So anytime that you've got a diagram of a bend there, it's going to place it with your bend schedule like we'd shown in the previous webinar. You can control the diagram scale of how large it shows there. And then also I've got my different options here, just like the before. I can change what I want it to say. If I wanted this to be QTY, I can move the spacing up and down there with my move up and down. I could delete or add new fields into there. Next, we have in our concrete options under fabricator setup, we have report manager. So this is going to be for exporting reports there, to where if I select on my foundation rebar schedule, I can click edit here. I've got my template, my title here of what I can call it, my output file name. So if I click browse here, I can go to my desktop, and then I could call this rebar, and then what you want to, if you want this to go into Excel, what you can do is call this a CSV. So if I call it rebar.csv, I can click save here. Now it's going to go to my desktop, and it's going to call it rebar.csv. And then just like when we're running reports, I can select my different members here to run that report on. Hit OK. And then I can either click run from this point, or if I click close, or sorry, OK here, and then if I select it, I can click my run button, and it's going to run the report. And then what I can do is I can open it in Excel with all my foundation rebar here, mark size, quantity, usage. I've got my different options here, or I've got that table. I was able to export it as a CSV file and open it up in Excel so that you guys can use that information in Excel there. So that would be with any of these reports in here, you can export them out to Excel as a CSV file. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the drawing editor rebar tools here for the information. So I'm going to go to my wall here. So some people are going to want to not show the rebar on there, but maybe have a call out for it. Just too much congestion. Maybe they just want to call out and do not want to see the rebar in there. So in this specific wall, I did not add any rebar in it, but I want to show that it's going to have it in there. So I'm going to go to my objects drop down, and then I have my rebar items here. I can either add it or add it as a combo. So I'll go ahead and add it as a combo. Maybe I want to point here. And then what this allows you to do is be able to type in what you want in there. So depending on what you all want to see, you've got your different check boxes. Maybe I want to call it RFB1, size maybe a number 7 here, and a length, say 20 foot long. So with that, I can go ahead and add in my values here, and this will show you what it will look like on the screen once I go ahead and place it. We'll talk about thumbnail and thumbnail scale using another tool like this here. And then you've got your different rotation, font styles, character, pen color, origin. So you've got your different options for that. If I go ahead and hit OK, you'll notice that it just throws in my number 7. I put in my piece mark and my length here. So if I just want to have a call out for that option there. Another option I have there is I have my Rebar runs here. So I can go to Objects drop down, Rebar runs, and I have Add. And then what I can do is I can pick the corners here and be able to add in my Rebar runs here. So I've got my height and my width here. Then I have my runs, my bar size, so I could come in here, put in, say, a number 7, 1 foot spacing, my laps, maybe at 1'8". Then go ahead and add in here, I've got a quantity of 1. I've got my size, number 7. My bar mark is B1, and then a length of 20'0". Then I can control my different font and color styles there. If I go ahead and hit OK, you'll notice that it puts in my one run, number 7, at 1 foot spacing with a lap of 1'8", and then my 1'7" with my piece mark in there. And it does actually put in the rebar into size here. So if I go ahead and edit this, let's say I change this to 40 foot long in my length here and click OK. Now you'll notice that it made this rebar 40 foot long. I can go ahead and change this to 20 foot long and say I have a quantity of 4 here. If I hit OK, now you can see it put in 4 quantities of my rebar in there. So that is another way to be able to add in your rebar runs if you do not want to see all the rebar in the drawing there. Let me go ahead and go into my erection view here. For the next tool is I have in my objects drop down, in my material callout, just like I had before with material with steel, is I can go ahead and pick my rebar with my material callout. And you'll notice that this is the same as my rebar item screen that I had done originally. So if I'm doing it with picking no rebar with my rebar item in the objects drop down, this will not be automatically filled out. But if I do, if I use the material callout, then it's going to come up and bring me my screen here to where it's going to fill it out, and I've got my different checkboxes where I can show. So maybe we've got right here. So the one thing I want to show here is with here is I can change. So we had talked about our thumbnail and thumbnail scale earlier, to where you see in here I've got my thumbnail to show my bend here. So if I click on the thumbnail, I've got my different options for my bends there. And then I also have a scale to where I can scale this up, maybe we'll go 0.25. And I can be able to scale up that thumbnail there. Maybe I do not want to see the planes on both ends here. All I have to do is uncheck those boxes for the left and the right plane there. And then they'll be gone. So anything that I do not want to see, so maybe coding, I can be able to change that with my material call out there. You can also see this had the rebar system in this slab here that we added in, and you can see that it is calling out my runs here. So my different runs, because I had it going each way there. And that concludes the concrete webinar part 2.